debate is about whether states have an ethical obligation to prevent, minimize, and anticipate the effects of climate change and mitigate adverse effects. That's the resolution. This is not about Western countries imposing stringent regulations on undeveloped countries and developing countries and saying, we're going to continue polluting. Because what we would say on the affirmative is the developed countries are not fulfilling their obligations. This is instead about a couple of questions. And the first is about the state's obligation to their own citizens. Because if you believe that climate change makes all the problems that a developing country is facing much, much worse in the present and in the future, then you have to believe that our side is right. Because if a state wants to provide for its own citizens, they also have to keep an eye out for climate change, right? And they ask the question, oh, but citizens are only living on $1 a day, so why would they have any obligation? What we would say is, all we're saying is they probably have an obligation to develop somewhat responsibly, right? If you want to provide for your citizens and make sure they don't suffer all these massive effects, you should develop in a way that doesn't maximize climate change, right? And they say, well, we'll just cross our fingers because countries like China do really great with reducing emissions. First of all, no, they don't, right? But in the meantime, even if you believe that once they reach development, they'll stop emitting, in the meantime, they're emitting a lot and contributing a lot to climate change. But furthermore, I'd like to challenge that premise too, because that's what actually is leading us to this entire problem of developing countries allowed to emit as much as they want and finally find, oh, okay, maybe we'll reduce it by 15%. We think that it's better to have an obligation to have them keep an eye out for the future. We think that this is really important. And I'd like to also talk a little bit about the negative effects of climate change, because their biggest attack is we haven't provided specific examples of illness. The IPCC report we gave is an example of global phenomena, right? But they also have actually individualized reports of countries that will be affected, like Mozambique or Bangladesh, right? So we don't have to tell you specifically what they are, but we gave you pretty good examples of how they'll be affected. For example, there'll be food scarcity, lack of clean water, for example, right? And they say, okay, but this will happen for a very long time. This will be very far out in the future. We don't necessarily think, first of all, that this is true, right? That coastal countries are often already suffering, and often a lot of them are poor and unable and ill-equipped to do so. Some countries include Burkina Faso or Nauru that have to deal with these problems. So if you believe that Burkina Faso and Nauru actually have to deal with these adverse effects of climate change, you're affirming our second half of the resolution. If you believe that these countries should provide for its own citizens and develop in a way that's responsible, then you're affirming our first half of the resolution. And therefore, I think it's pretty clear. But the question, I think, in this debate is why developing countries? Why not just developed countries? Because they contribute a lot, and we agree with that. But what we also would tell you is that a lot of developing countries are going to become major contributors, and they should keep this eye out on the future. What are some good examples, right? Good examples are China and India that 20 years ago didn't emit much. But because they have done so in a way that is not necessarily the most responsible for their own citizens or the global citizens in general, we see massive problems that they're causing for their own citizens from pollution and climate change, right? And we think that that's really important. I think the last attack they've given us is this idea of colonialism. We don't support having developed countries impose massive restrictions. What we instead is developed countries might even have an obligation to fund green energy if that's the best option. We think that this entails an obligation to developed countries. Thank you.